is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Marriage before the age of 18 is a violation of human rights. That's according to the United Nations Convention of the Rights of the Child. However, 1 in 5 women globally are still married off as children, despite near universal commitments to root out the practice. Even as slow gains are being made in tackling the marriage of children, up to 765 million people have been married off as minors. So what issues are at play in this seemingly entrenched practice? And can the world succeed in eliminating child marriage? I am Liu Feifei. Welcome to Talk Africa. Childhood marriage compromises a child's development by resulting in early pregnancies, interrupted schooling, limited opportunities for vocational and career progress, as well as social isolation. For the girl child, there's also an increased risk of domestic violence, while boys face adult responsibilities and economic pressures which they may not be prepared for. And that's according to a recent UNICEF report on child marriage around the world. But despite these known harmful effects, the practice is still widespread, with millions today having been married off before their 18th birthday. Gains in tackling child marriage have been made over the past decade, but a lot more remains to be done in some parts of the world. Let's take a look at how different regions compare.
Child marriage globally has registered a 15% decline over the past 10 years. 1 out of 5 are now married off before the age of 18, compared to 1 in 4 children in 2009. Up to 25 million child marriages have been prevented in this period, following increased awareness levels and advocacy action. While this reduction is positive, no region around the world is on track to meet the Sustainable Development Goal target of eliminating the harmful practice by 2030. That's according to a recent report by UNICEF. In terms of regions, Southeast Asia records the highest prevalence rate of child marriage among girls, accounting for 44% of the practice globally. Sub-Saharan Africa comes in second at 18%, followed by the East Asia Pacific with 12%. Latin America and the Caribbean regions are at 9%, while the Middle East and North Africa represent 5%. Other regions across the world, including Eastern Europe, account for 12% of girl brides. While the practice of child marriage has been well studied among girls, little information has existed to date about child marriage among boys. According to UNICEF, out of the global total of 765 million, 650 million people today were married off as girls, while 115 million boys and men were married as children.
And to help us unpack this discussion today, I'm joined by Sonal Kapoor in New Delhi. She's the founder director of the Protsahan India Foundation, which is an action and advocacy-based NGO that fights child abuse in India's underserved communities. In the studio, we have Wanjala Wafura, founder of the Coexist Initiative, an organization working around gender rights advocacy in Africa. Thank you both for joining us.
It's my pleasure.
The generally accepted definition for child marriage is whereby it's a formal marriage or an informal union where one or both parties are under the age of 18. The United Nations now, a few years ago, in fact, has come out and said that child marriage is a violation of fundamental human rights. Wanjala, you are, in fact, an advocate for gender equality. What do you make of this characterization of child marriage as a violation of human rights?
I totally agree that child marriage is indeed a violation of all the rights of children. In fact, one of the things that I believe in is that girls must be allowed to be girls and not brides, because the entire definition of a girl in the African sense is defined around patriarchy, where the men exercise their power by subjugating women and girls particularly, where women's bodies are used to justify men's existence, and where girls are socialized right from infancy, that they only find definition in life if they can be accepted by men. The earlier they are accepted, the lovelier they are. So I totally support. The problem is we have too many definitions of that child marriage that is confusing, because the UN, which is a global movement, UNICEF has its own definition. Each country has its own definition. You go to Mozambique, I've been to countries from Casablanca in Morocco to Cape Town, and each country you go to has its own age limit. For example, Zambia has now raised its age limit of marriage to 19, while its neighbor Zimbabwe has lowered it to 15. So we don't have a universally accepted mechanism of defining exactly what age is workable. Because in Kenya, the UN will tell you we are funding projects for children as long as their children as long as they are below 18. And yet when you go to places in like Garissa, where they still have projects, I've met girls who are working for the UN in the UN camps, and they are married and they age 14.
In fact, it is a very complicated question, isn't it? Really, at the heart of it is that what age can you give consent to have sexual relations, I suppose. And perhaps it is, in fact, different from person to person. But at some point, someone needs to put a stake in the ground and make a decision. So now to you in India, you are an advocate in this space as well. In fact, you advocate for the end of child trafficking, the end to child sexual abuse, and the end of child marriage in India. India is a unique place because India has the world's highest number, if I'm correct, of child brides. And also, what people might find surprising is that in India, child marriage is in fact illegal, but nonetheless, it's taking place at alarming rates. So now I want to ask you, not for Sanal the advocate, but for the average Indian person, the farmer, the average worker, do they see child marriage as a violation of human rights, or is it a solution, a pragmatic solution to some of the problems that they face?
I think, even so as Protsahan, we always say that child marriage is, nothing but child sexual abuse. When you have a girl who's 8 years, 10 years, 12 years, to get into sexual relations with somebody who's either as young as 17, 18-year-old boy or a 60-year-old man, 70-year-old man, child marriage is nothing but CSA, or child sexual abuse, as we say. And it is a gross violation of human rights, because the minute you get, and it's not, something that only girls end up getting abused with. Little boys, a boy who gets married at 15, what future, what life does he have, right? Of course, it affects girls so much more, because girls are even married to 25, 30, 35-year, 60-year-old men. But so yes, child brides, and as you rightly said, in India, more than 1/5 of the world's child brides are from India. And it's a gross violation, because the minute you get a little girl married, you have stopped her education. She's out of school. She's, there is no physical, mental, maturity or growth that she'll, go forward with, because the minute she's married, within the next 18 months, within the next year or so, she'll have her own child. So a child having a child, how justified is that?
In fact, one of the points that she made, Wanjala, is that besides girls who are being married off under the age of 18, so are boys. According to this new UNICEF report, an estimated 115 million boys or men were married before they were 18, and of that number, 1 in 5, that's about 23 million, were married under the age of 15. Now, your initiative, the Coexist initiative, actually works with men and boys to bring about gender equality. What are the ramifications for boys? This is not something that's often talked about. We talk about the girl bride. What about the boy groom? What are the ramifications of them being married off so early?
I'll give you 2 quick examples before I go into details. I was in Malawi, and I passed a place where the boys were playing, young boys were playing football, and then the young girls were doing the jumping of the rope. It's called skipping of the rope. And then they had a heap of children under a tree. They had about 30 children under a tree. And so I went to ask the girls, whose children are these who are just crying and slept around? And said, they are our children. None of those girls was above 12 years old. I said, but where are their fathers? They said their fathers are the ones playing football, and the fathers were, none of them was above 15 years. The consequences of child marriage, it affects both men and women and girls. The boys drop out of school. Some of them even are forced, many of them are forced to end up in the streets because they can't raise. Once they have a family, a boy who is 14 and has been forced to marry, once they have a family, they cannot take care of the family, they run in the streets. Some end up into crime. You know, they end up becoming petty thieves to start surviving. Some just go into drugs. You go to villages in Tanzania where you have a village where half of the boys are underage because they were forced to marry, and some of them were forced to marry more than one wife. They can't afford to feed themselves, and yet they were forced by community to marry, become relevant. So the ramifications are as much as to the boys. And for the girls, it's obvious. Many of them get infected with diseases because they don't even know the health conditions of how to take care of their sexual reproductive lives. Many of them drop out of school. That consequences are lifelong. Many of them end up being abused. Many of them go into abusive relationships, get married to men who abuse them, because men also didn't even want to marry them. So you look at the rate of HIV infection, for example, among young girls. Many of these girls are the ones who got into sexual relationships early. And so because the men who marry them use them more of like products and goods more than like human beings. They do not know their rights. Many of them are forced to believe in things they don't believe. They're forced to believe in religions and faiths that they don't believe in. So many of them are actually, in a way, sort of taken like products to be used and abused, and not human beings to be respected.
Today, around the world, about 12 million girl brides are being created every year. What are these drivers that's making this happen?
There are many. I mean, child marriage is driven by a million of factors. I'll perhaps go to 20, but before that, I just wanted to mention something that Snell mentioned. That as much as we have a 17-year-old can fall in love with a 15-year-old, and they don't have the right to consent. There's something called consent. If a young children who are below the age can't consent in law, so it depends on whichever law, whichever country they're living in, and what is the age of consent. For example, in Kenya, the age of consent is 18 years. Anything below that age of 18 cannot be legally. Any child or any man can be prosecuted, and a man who is above 18 cannot fall in love with a girl who's below 18, or a girl for vice versa. So it has to be consent. It depends on the national law and the systems that have been set in place. Number one, there are so many factors that cause child marriages. The first one that causes it is just patriarchy. Patriarchy is a sense of entitlement where men are born to think and socialize to think that they're entitled to women's bodies and children's bodies. And so even children are socialized so in many African countries that I've been to. Children are socialized so to believe. That's why you have girls being taught how to run, jump the rope and look for firewood, and while boys are being taught how to play football and to do boxing. They're being socialized into natural roles that they're supposed to play in, and therefore sex and marriage becomes the next thing. Number two, just the total negative socialization in our process in our villages, where, for example, there's a higher premium put on boys than a higher premium put on girls. So girls are naturally, when you go to a house, the first person to ask for water to drink is a young girl and not a young boy. And you see young boys looking after cattle and young girls looking. So the premium, the value we put on our children, especially girls. Number three is the fact that we don't implement any existing laws. I've been to countries like Somalia and Sudan, where you ask, is child marriage illegal here? First of all, they don't even know what child marriage is, and then we don't implement the laws. So in Kenya, for example, we have the Sexual Offences Act, we have the Children's Act, but you ask the High Court in Kenya, for example, or Uganda, or those African countries, you say, how many people have been arrested because of child marriages? No. How many people have disclosed of child marriages? No one. So because of that reluctance from the systems to be able to implement existing legislation. The fifth point is budgets. we are a continent, Africa is very good as a continent to pass legislation. Oh, we are passing the Sexual Offences Act, but how much of that goes into a budgeting process?
Well, on that note, I want to turn over to Sanal, because certainly all the different factors that you've mentioned, Sanal, are those the same drivers in India driving these statistics for child marriages? And what about tradition and culture? That's something very steep in India. Can you elaborate?
One, definitely patriarchy, as he said, because, patriarchy, I think it's not just, it happens because it's been happening, or I think men, women, both are equally responsible for some of those things that have been passed down, right? And in addition to that, it is also a lot of intergenerational poverty. When you have 6 kids, when you have 7 kids, you have, who don't have much difference in, one is 10, one is 12, one is 13, 14, 18, when you have kids like in that age groups, you easily want to get them married off, because you feel that, oh, if it's a girl in India, there is something called dowry as well. So every time you get a girl married off, so again, it might be a law on paper that if you take dowry, you give dowry, you can be booked under the law. But it happens all the time. It happens all the time, and everybody chooses to keep a blind eye to it. And I think people actually, even the most educated ones, leave alone the fact that I think much more than intergenerational poverty, it is patriarchy that seeds it. Because even in the most affluential households, the rich households, dowry is still dowry is basically every time you get your girl married, you are giving money to the groom's family. Right? And I think it's not a poor and a rich thing. It happens in the richest of houses. The amount of dowry varies. So basically that, we are giving you our girl along with huge amounts of money, or, cars, you name the brand of the car, and that goes along with it. I think it's so much of patriarchy and it's so much of hypocrisy that it all comes together to, basically treat our girls and young kids and women as just objects who are to be commodified. And I think that's where this problem stems from.
And on that note, we'll take a short break. When we come back, we'll look at the consequences and possible solutions of child marriage. Talk Africa continues in a moment. Stay tuned.
China Global Television Network. From broadcast centers in Beijing, Washington and Nairobi. A unique global perspective. 6 channels and a video content service. News when you want it and where you want it. On TV screens, websites, mobile platforms and social media. CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back to Talk Africa. We're joined by Sanal Kapoor in New Delhi, and Wanjala Wafula is here with me in the studio. And let's continue our discussion on child marriage. Before the break, Sanal was talking about the bride price in India. And I think there's a unique link, isn't it? It seems to be a common thread, because that's also a phenomenon in Africa. In South Africa, it's called the lobola. Because when you look at child marriages, it happens across countries, it happens across cultures, across religions. But the one thing is that there seems to be an economic, financial transaction. It happens in the poorest areas of the poorest countries the most. And when you distill it down, it seems to be the selling of young underage girls for sex, for money. Sometimes it's a cow, sometimes it's goats, sometimes it's money. This does not seem right. So do you think progress is being made here in Africa?
Yes. There's a lot of progress, and I'm actually very excited that this is when 15 years ago, when we started talking about child marriages, 15 years ago, it was like nobody knew about it. But now the public awareness levels have gone high. You can hear, for example, in countries like Rwanda and Burundi and Uganda, and even here in Kenya, that issues around child marriages and protection of women's rights are issues that as far as are discussed as far as Parliament. So the levels have gone up. The media has become very sensitive. I mean, that's why we are having this conversation here. The media has become very sensitive. We are having lots of live stories. We're having lots of. I was in a court. I went to a court in Kajiado County on the Kenya-Uganda-Tanzania border, and the magistrate sentenced one of the boys to 7 years imprisonment because he was 21, but he was caught having married a girl who was I think 8 years old. So even prosecutions are happening. Even levels of awareness are happening. The value of the girl child is being negotiated. The constitution, for example, in Kenya and Rwanda and Burundi has given direct free education to girls. So now girls can be able to transit from primary to secondary to so there's a lot of hope for girls.
So that is definitely a very positive
Yes.
development here on the continent. So now in India as well, in fact, India is the one place where the rate of child marriage has dropped the most. I believe it's dropped by from nearly 1/3, from 50% of girls under the age of 18 to about 30% of the girls under the age of 18 being married off. What did India get right?
I think I think the awareness and a lot of activism and advocacy by the non-profit organizations. Having said that, there are a lot of the state governments that are doing such beautiful work. There's quite a bit of stuff that's happened in Madhya Pradesh. There's very good work that's happened in Bihar. Personally, there are stories that I know. Rajasthan, for that matter, has done a lot of good work in making sure that child marriages don't happen. But for every 10 great stories, we have 2 heart-wrenching stories of failure, where we sacrificed our girls to this entire practice. And I think though we are moving forward, we need as a community just the entire understanding of child protection. I think that's lacking. So even though we have come down in our rate, the incidences of child brides or child marriages from 50 to 30% in the last so many years, I think if in the last so many years it's come down from 50 to 30, I'm just a little emphatic and enthusiastic that it's going to come down from 30 to 0. And I think we need to look at the larger picture as well, but not forget our little survivors and sheroes, and we shouldn't stop celebrating them.
Well, that's very optimistic, but Wanjala, people's religious beliefs are their deepest beliefs, and their traditions are their way of life. How do you come and try to, as you said with the chiefs, how do you come and try to change the way people have lived for generations, hundreds, thousands of years?
That's that's interesting you say. Sorry, I'm choking. That's interesting you say, because religions have also, there are things that are perpetuated by religion that sometimes are outwardly criminal. Because you cannot say, for example, some religions will tell you that the children will not be immunized against polio. If you don't immunize your child against polio, the child will die of an infection. Or there are things that will say, oh, don't participate in a health drill. So, of course, we agree that religion plays an important role. We cannot use religion as an excuse to destroy generations. We cannot use religion, for example, to say, if there was a religion that said people should be doing drugs, because I come from a village where we have a cult there that calls itself a religion, but the first condition for you to join that religion is for you to start doing bang. And we've been stopping children from going to that religion because it has destroyed a generation. Child marriage robs a generation, robs lives of villages, robs people of hope. And if there's any religion or faith or culture that purports it, it's a wrong religion. The same culture that says men are superior than women, it's a wrong religion. My father used to believe he's late now, used to believe that girls were not important, but he finally took 2 girls to university, and the girls came back and bought him the best car that he had and built him the biggest houses. He became an advocate for girls' education. So we have to stop having these excuses of culture and religion and a way of life and poverty and everything else. Because I have seen poor people who have been able to raise their children and have been able to overcome that poverty through empowerment. Like Sunil is saying, you don't overcome poverty by selling off your children and later making them have more poor people in the world. So it's not. Of course, we know that people are of course, I respect culture and tradition. But I also want to respect a culture that reflects the 21st century.
So in your opinion, the religion and culture should be fluid, should be living and changing. So now to you in India, of course, India as a country is steep in its history and culture and religion. What right do you think people from the outside have to come into this country and tell the Indian people what is right, what is wrong, what is good, and what is evil? Who is a true arbiter of moral authority?
I think it's not about people coming from outside to, you know, tell Indians about what is to be done, etc. I don't think that's right. I feel that we globally, you know, we are living in times where religion and nationalism are your shields to do anything which is wrong, or anything which, you know, I think anything that you want to justify and you don't have a logical argument to justify, you will always use religion or nationalism as your counter. And I think that's the very premise where it is flawed. And I think just how we have treated our women, we have also treated our children wrong. And I think it's time enough. You know, there were enough Me Too movements that started. They were kind of also, you know, made to kind of, really shut. You know, I think social media is one thing that I have a lot of belief in. And I have a lot of belief in the young people, because even India as a country, we have a demographic dividend, which is, you know, we're going to be the youngest country in the next couple of years. Across the world, we're going to be the youngest country. And if the young people don't understand that our children, that our girls need to be protected and nurtured, and if we are hiding behind the facets of religion or culture, as you rightly said, culture is something that needs to be questioned and can be, you know, it can be evolving, and the best things need to kind of be put together and taken to the next step. But if we are living in the 18th century thinking that's the culture, I think then there is no probably evolution that has happened. As human beings, we have to evolve. If we have chosen not to evolve and we have hidden behind the garb of nationalism or culture or religion, I think that very premise or the very logic is absolutely flawed, and we will never do justice to our children in that case.
And that's all we have time for this week. A big thank you to my guests for sharing their expertise and experiences with us. Sonal Kapoor in New Delhi. She's the founder director of the Protsahan India Foundation, which is an action and advocacy-based NGO that fights child abuse in India's underserved communities. In studio is Wanjada Wafura, founder of the Coexist Initiative, an organization working around gender rights advocacy in Africa. Now, we'd love to hear your feedback on this topic through our social media handles on Facebook and Twitter. You can also catch this and more episodes of Talk Africa on our YouTube playlist and the CGTN Africa website. Do keep the conversation going and tune in again next week for more of Talk Africa. From me, Liu Feifei, it's goodbye and see you next time.